of reasons, but some of which we were still shaking out of First Interstate. There was a lot of stuff going on, but we still returned 28%. The problem was they returned 41. This reminds me of a joke that I read actually in a magazine article. I guess it's an old farmer's joke. You'd have to tell me. And what's the most effective way to generate a small fortune? Or what's the easiest way to generate a small fortune? Start with a big one. That's right. And in this case, our shareholders did not fare as well as our peers. So let's look at what would have happened, what would have had to happen based on that same slide a couple slides ago in order for us to keep up with the peer average. And it's very simple, going back to the NIAC analogy. It all has to do with NIAC. The cash flows that we generated net of our cost of capital. And in this case, we were down, based on that, the difference in that 28% and the 40%, about $3 billion. Because using that number, our market cap should have been $32.2 billion. And our premium, because our book value really didn't change, our premium should have been $19.6 billion. Another way of saying that is we should have generated 200 to 300 more million in NIAC. And essentially all you do with that is you discount it back to the present value. You do exactly what NIAC did when he bought his building, and you take these cash flows and you divide it by that cost of capital rate. In NIAC's case, when he bought the building, it was 10%. In our case, it's 12%. Divide it in there, it gives you about $3 billion. That's the difference. We just didn't generate enough income.
What would our share price have been?
Yeah, you know, Dave, all we'd have to do is divide the number of shares into that. I'm sorry, I didn't do that math. Yeah, just divide the number of shares outstanding into that 32 billion. You could have. You want to answer that question now? I have to say, Don and I had a lot of fun putting this together. In fact, Matthew Rafesland, Jim Wallace, and Don and I all did a lot of work on this, and it's been a lot of fun. But this was a good news, bad news story. What's the bad news? The bad news is we didn't hit it. We returned less to our shareholders than we could have. The good news is, okay, I'm saying this in the context of a presentation, so I have to warrant this a little bit. The good news for me is buy some stock, because I know our business. I know what we're capable of doing. I know what the issues were a couple of years ago, and I know where we're at today. I know how we're set up against our competitors in the market. I know by getting focused on the real drivers of value, we can not only make up the premium, we can crush it. And when that happens, the market has a certain expectation of us. When you beat the market's expectation, you know what happens. They discount it back and share price rises. So the opportunity for us is we're going to make up the deficit and we're going to crush it. 374 is what the share price would have been. There you go. Would have been 374. So using that same logic that we had earlier in looking at this framework, we're pushing this down. Sorry, I lost my place. So again, now we're down at the BLD level. Sorry about that. We're down at the BLD level, and we're starting to ask questions like, okay, in order to do this, now that we know what the NIAC generation for the company should have been, and we'll talk about our group in a second, we start asking questions out here. As we start talking about where can we get the biggest bang for our buck? Where can we generate the most NIAC? Should we invest in new loans, customer retention, or some other business? Should we go in some other direction? Should we focus on cash management? What kind of risk can we afford to take? What opportunities are there still remaining to cut costs, re-engineer, and increase productivity? There are still opportunities, but I'm going to talk about that in a second because I don't think that's where the biggest lift is. And remember, the reason that we have to make these choices are we're dealing with finite amounts of money. Colleen referenced $70 million. We have $70 million to employ in the most productive way we can to deliver back to the shareholders as much value as we can create. And again, hopefully those shareholders are us in the form of our TAP and any stock that we bought outside of that, so that you're sensitive to it. And you say, geez, more NIAC? It's good for everyone, not just my job security. So now we're going to talk about your role in increasing the share price. Basically, this is the formula again. And at the risk of oversimplifying it, it really is just adding another line to a statement of cash flows or income statement that pays back our shareholders for using their capital. And again, that rate's 12%. So what they say is to give us 12%, that's at least how much they need back. So it's backed out of the income. The equity allocation, what drives an equity? We're a fairly highly leveraged business, those of you that may or may not know. Our equity allocation, we get, when we make $1 of loan, when we make a loan for $1, we get an equity allocation of 7.4% now? Yeah. So 7.4 cents of every dollar is equity. So we're a fairly highly leveraged business. That's good news. And the way that the equity allocation gets determined, and you'll see this in Todd and Pam's session, is it's really based on the relative riskiness of the business. Our equity allocation used to be higher. And the good news about that is our loan portfolio is considered to be stable. It's been around for a while, so the bank has decided we're less risky than we used to be, so our equity allocation has come down. And that's a good news because that cost of capital is multiplied against our equity. So we can generate NIAC a little bit easier now. Again, and I'll give you an analogy for this, special purpose property, more or less equity required? More. Why? Riskier. Thank you. Yeah, I hope you all stay CLOs after this. Yeah, 12%. And I'll give you just a quick back of the envelope. Where cost of capital comes from is it's a secure return or some kind of guaranteed return. So we'll say 10-year Treasury, right? That's pretty safe. Most people would say that a 10-year Treasury, you can pretty much buy a Treasury and plan on getting that back. It's a safe rate of return. In order to invest in a bank, you need something more than that because when I buy the shares of a bank, the return is not necessarily guaranteed, right? It's a little riskier than buying the Treasuries. And our risk premium as an industry is about 6%, roughly. Okay? So you take the Treasury rate plus 6%. This is very rough back of the envelope. So say the Treasury rate is 6%. You add 6%. That's 12%. And then it's multiplied by the company's beta, the volatility in earnings that a company demonstrates. So that's where our cost of capital comes from. And it ends up being 12%. So what drives NIAC for the business loan division? Let me just leave this up for a second, and I know you have the slides in your binders. So let me ask the question, which of these factors do you influence? How about revenues? All of them? That's fair. How about expenses? I heard cost of acquisition. Actually, I would argue that you also can influence cost of servicing and collections. If you set someone up on Gateway coming in, the relative cost of servicing that customer is going to be lower. If they're on auto pay versus not on auto pay, their cost of servicing is going to be lower, particularly if we don't get the premium that we're supposed to get when someone is off of auto pay, and I know that's been an issue, as you all know, at one point or another. That just takes money right out of us. So I think you can have at least some influence over it. You may not be the primary influencer, but you can sure have an impact. And I see Bruno and Lynn nodding, since they're ultimately responsible for delivering on that piece to a large extent. How about losses? I think Mike James talked a lot about losses, particularly the adverse selection piece. When someone gets thrown out of another bank and we welcome them, we throw them a party and welcome them in. The question is, was there something we should have known? Why were they being thrown out of another bank? So we can have a big impact on that. Equity. Can you impact equity? Man, you're good. Yeah, you may not be able to, you're not the one that's going to set the equity allocation, but you can sure, by the business decisions you employ, certainly help, and you have. Really, you should all sit back and say, hey, I impacted the equity allocation for this division because how stable we've been and how predictable our income stream has been and our loss profile, Mike went through that, has impacted the equity allocation, and you should all feel pretty good about that. Absolutely, absolutely. Because that's an average. So if it's a much higher risk loan internally, we're going to charge a different equity allocation. That's why the price is higher. It's one of the reasons the price is higher. Okay. So I think you get a sense here of what are the